It was a freezing December morning in North Florida, peak duck hunting season. But no one was hunting that day on the west corner of Lake Seminole. The mist that shrouded the normally serene shoreline was lifting as a crowd of game wardens, sheriff's deputies, and locals gathered near a boat ramp. A sense of urgency hung heavy in the air.
More boats were showing up, more officers were showing up.
Scott Dungy stood at the lake's edge looking out into the murky waters when he spotted a helicopter clear the tree line.
So it landed 100 yards away from where everybody was gathered on the side of the lake.
The rotor blades slowed to a standstill. The door swung open, and a man in a green flight suit stepped out.
The pilot came over, introduced himself. I just told the pilot, I'm going in the helicopter with you.
Scott wasn't a policeman or an emergency worker. He was out there looking for his friend.
Mike hadn't come home yet from duck hunt.
It had been over 24 hours since anyone had heard from Mike. Something was definitely wrong. And in these freezing temperatures, Scott knew they had to act fast.
I was kind of excited that we're in the helicopter, we're going to find him, and everything's going to be fine. I'm going to be the one to find my buddy. I'm going to be a hero.
The chopper lifted up into the pale blue sky, and Lake Seminole stretched out below. Search boats zigzagged between patches of thick weeds covering the surface. Scott had spent his life in North Florida swamps just like this, hunting ducks and pulling fish out of the water. But this corner of the lake was different.
It was an old flooded pecan orchard that was probably 600 yards long and maybe 200 yards wide.
Stumps of sunken trees rose up from the water like tombstones.
And just as many trees that were standing above the water, there was just that many stumps underneath the water. Hundreds of tree stumps that you can't see from the boat.
And they were slowing down the search.
We had people falling out of the boats just because they'd hit a stump and you didn't know it was there.
And that gave Scott a hunch about what had happened to his friend Mike.
I said, okay, if he's gone out and he fell overboard, the water's super cold now, the weather's cold.
It didn't look good. Looking out over the lake, Scott spotted an island. It was nothing more than a patch of mud covered in gray, dead grass. Maybe that's where Mike was.
Hopefully he got his waders off and he was able to swim to the other side and maybe had a concussion and was knocked out somewhere on their island.
Scott told the pilot to hover above it.
It was overgrown, so it was hard to see. Couldn't see much.
Then Scott spotted something. Not far from the island, there was something moving, just beneath the surface of the water.
The water was very clear because it was in the winter, so you'd see the full body.
A dark shadow.
And there were 6 or 8 of them, just swimming all around the boats. 8, 10, 12-foot alligators. The people in the boat had no idea that there was a gator even remotely close to them.
That's when he realized.
I thought, okay, if he did fall out somewhere,
time was running out.
We got to get him before the alligators get him.
As the helicopter turned back, Scott looked at the dark waters below him. He knew it was going to take more than a helicopter ride to find his buddy. But what Scott didn't know, as the chopper landed that freezing Florida day, there were other unseen forces at hand, other figures in the shadows lurking close by, who did know where Mike was. And they were more vicious than any alligator.
Since his death in 2009, the world has struggled with how Michael Jackson should be remembered, as the king of pop or as a monster. The new podcast, Think Twice, Michael Jackson, offers a fresh perspective on the art and the artist, his life, his work, and his legacy. Listen to Think Twice, Michael Jackson, wherever you get your podcasts.
In this country, some truths aren't self-evident. In NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of stories as wide-ranging and real as the people who tell them, we celebrate the Black experience for all its soul and richness. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get podcasts.
From Wondery, I'm Jennifer Portman, and this is Over My Dead Body, Gone Hunting.
Baby, I'm guilty. I got his blood on my hands.
Baby, you're crazy. I never touched that man.
This is episode 1, The Eyes Have It. On the far northern edge of Tallahassee, miles from the Capitol building, there's a narrow road off a long stretch of county blacktop that most people have no reason to travel on. Go down that road, and you'll hit a plain white mailbox. That's your sign to turn off, right into the woods. One day in May 2006, I made that right turn and followed the path surrounded by towering trees, wondering whether I had come to the right place. I was a reporter at the local newspaper, the Tallahassee Democrat, and I was new in the area, following my spidey sense for news. I drove carefully, keeping my tires on 2 strips of asphalt that led to a red mobile home tucked in the woods. I made my way to the back of the house and knocked. A woman in her early 60s answered the door. She had blonde hair tied up in 2 short pigtails that seemed like they belonged on a young girl, not a grandmother. But there this woman was, defying time, and I would soon learn much else. This was Cheryl Williams. She invited me inside into her kitchen, and as we sat down at the kitchen table, she began to tell me a story. It was a story about her missing son, Mike Williams, who had been gone for 6 years at that point. But she made it clear the story didn't begin on the day of Mike's disappearance. It was a story about a marriage, a group of friends, and beyond them, an entire community that seemed eager to move on from what had happened to Mike. People in Tallahassee like to call their city a big, small town. It's the state capital and home to 3 colleges, with politicians and students constantly cycling through. At the same time, people who were born and raised here will tell you that Tallahassee is a close-knit town, one where locals have known each other their entire lives, go to church together, go to school together, and they look out for one another. But there's another side to small towns. They can close ranks. They can push out people who speak up, and they can bury secrets. The story Cheryl wanted to tell me was about all those things, and it started when Mike was not much more than a kid. The things that happened then, the people he'd grown close to, I needed to understand all of that if I was going to get the real story. Mike Williams grew up in the same mobile home where I would visit his mother, Cheryl. Mike's father, Jerry, was a Greyhound bus driver, gone a lot, bringing in a working-class salary. Cheryl stayed at home to raise Mike and his older brother, Nick, and ran an at-home daycare for other children in town. The Williams family trusted in God, and Cheryl and Jerry taught their sons the value of hard work. Mike took those lessons to heart. By the time he was a teenager attending North Florida Christian School, it was clear to friends like Scott Dungy he was out to build a better life for himself.
He would get up at 3, 4 in the morning on a school day every day and go stock shelves at the local grocery. And then on weekends, he would roof houses. He worked 3 jobs. He played football. He ran track. He would spend the weekends with us at the beach. He only slept 2 or 3 hours a night.
But the thing Scott loved about Mike is that as determined as he was, Mike didn't take himself too seriously.
He was so goofy and funny and always had you laughing, and just a naive, innocently good person.
Everyone loved that about Mike. Who wouldn't love a guy like that? Hardworking, from humble origins, who just seemed like he wanted to be your friend. Always a smile. No obvious chip on his shoulder. And that was probably why no one batted an eye when he started dating one of the more popular girls in his sophomore year. Her name was Denise Merrill. Denise was a cheerleader, pretty with brown hair, and from a much better off family than Mike.
You know, you've got Mike from one side of the tracks and you've got Denise from the other side. Her dad worked for the state. In those circles, they were well known and well respected.
She was also, Scott Dungy remembers, not exactly the work 3 jobs while barely sleeping type.
She was very loud. She and I butted heads sometimes. Just kind of train wreck in the mornings, always late, always doing her makeup as she came into class.
But maybe because they were so different, the relationship just worked for both of them.
Everybody knew from the time they got together that they were going to get married. That was a pretty well-known fact.
At North Florida Christian, they were a power couple. By senior year, Mike was president of the student council and was voted best personality. Denise was class secretary and was voted best dressed. And Mike and Denise spent a lot of their time with another power couple, Kathy Aldridge and Brian Winchester. Kathy had been on the cheerleading squad with Denise.
Super nice, super sweet girl. Came from a good family. Been around town a long time.
Kathy's boyfriend, Brian Winchester, was from a well-established Tallahassee family too. His dad, Marcus, ran a successful insurance business, and the family drove around in a custom-outfitted Jeep. While Mike worked multiple jobs, Brian never had to. The two boys came from very different worlds. But even so, Brian welcomed Mike into his family.
Brian's dad, Marcus, is the one that taught Mike how to hunt, how to shoot a gun safety. Mike's dad was gone a lot. He was working and providing for his family. So Marcus kind of took him under his wing and, was a de facto dad for him.
So the foursome, Mike, Denise, Kathy, and Brian, they had a lot of history together, and they were inseparable.
It was kind of like the Rat Pack. They did literally everything together. If they went out, they all went out together. If they were going to lunch, they went to lunch together.
Nothing changed as they got older. They remained friends all throughout college and got married around the same time. And when Denise got pregnant, well, Kathy did too. They even prepared for it together.
So I taught childbirth classes here for years, and we would have 10 to 12 couples in a class.
Blythe Newsom was a friend of Denise's from childhood.
And so, of course, when Denise got pregnant, she was like, we're going to take your childbirth class. We have to. So she signed up, and Kathy and Brian signed up, and they came to the class that first night, and it was a large group. And they just weren't real comfortable.
That didn't surprise Blythe. Mike, Denise, Kathy, and Brian had all grown up in traditional Christian households.
Growing up, talking about sex and childbirth and things like that, I don't think you had these really open conversations.
So according to Blythe, Brian approached her and said, "Can the 4 of us just do a private birthing class?"
I don't remember exactly what he said, but I remember it was just sort of strange because I don't think Kathy and Denise really cared. They wanted to experience, the childbirth class.
Blythe was happy to do the private classes, and it gave her an opportunity to see how the two couples interacted.
Mike was always quiet. Denise was her laughable, lovable self, and so was Kathy. Kathy was a little quieter than Denise, but it was really fun. Brian would always sort of be in the middle.
Brian seemed to call the shots. He was the one who proposed and maybe decided what the foursome would be doing. The one who had asked for special treatment and gotten his way, even if the other 3 might not have cared. It wasn't a big deal in the birthing class, but Blythe came away with a distinct impression of Brian and what his presence might mean to the people around him.
I felt like Denise and Kathy sort of held back, but he was just sort of always the dominant figure.
But Blythe shrugged that off. What she noticed about that group just as much was that one of the members seemed destined to be a great parent.
But I will tell you this, I think Mike was ready. He just took to having a baby like that's what his arms were for.
And Denise didn't seem far behind him.
I think they were both, Denise and Mike, just put on this earth to be that beautiful little girl's parents.
We're just totally overwhelmed.
A TV news crew from a local Tallahassee station was at the hospital. They were doing a story about new moms on Mother's Day. Denise had given birth to her and Mike's daughter, Ansley, just the day before. The camera pointed at Denise in floral print pajamas, cradling her newborn baby.
She was due Tuesday, and she would have maybe waited a whole nother year for Mother's Day, so she came yesterday so I could enjoy this day today with her.
Mike stood beside Denise wearing a baseball hat.
It was unbelievable. I have a whole new respect for my wife and women in general and what they go through to bring a new child, new life into the world.
I mean, his eyes were wide open.
Clay Ketchum was Mike's boss. He'd known Mike since he first hired him out of college.
And he came in and he said, Mr. Ketchum, I've never had so much respect for a woman having a baby in my entire life. This is really something. He said, it's an incredibly difficult process. You would have thought he was the only person in the world that had ever had a baby. I'm going, Mike, I've had 3 of them, but you go right ahead.
But that giddiness, that feeling of Mike's that he was uniquely blessed, it was about to crash against a more sober reality. Blythe Newsom, Denise's childbirth educator friend, had told the couples, this parenting thing, it's gonna get harder before it gets easier. Way harder.
When you're a new mom, all these hormones that have taken 40 weeks to build up, all of a sudden all these hormones are coming crashing down, and there are emotions, and it's one of the top 5 most stressful things that can happen. It's right up there with death.
And it seemed like that was what was happening to Denise. Like a lot of mothers, the high of childbirth was followed by a difficult come down. And Mike, being Mike, he stepped up. His boss, Clay Ketchum, could see he was taking on more and more responsibilities at home.
He started doing all the shopping, and then he started doing all the cooking. He didn't want Denise to have to do anything. You just heal up, you just rest up, you just be a mom, and I'll do it all.
Mike had always been devoted to Denise. His co-workers would tease him about running to the gas station to pump gas for her. But Clay began to wonder if something else was going on. It had been a year. Mother's Day was coming around again, and Clay asked Mike what they had planned.
He said Denise wanted some time off, and I said, what? And he said, yeah, she just wants to sleep late. She just wants to do nothing, just be by herself. And he said, so, I got her a hotel room downtown. It was called the Governor's Inn.
It was a small hotel about a block north of the Capitol in Tallahassee.
So that's where she wanted to go for Mother's Day weekend.
It seemed like a strange place for Denise to go on her own. It was a business hotel, the kind of place lobbyists would stay.
I thought, man, it just sounded like somebody trying to get away for a weekend with their lover. I mean, that's exactly what it sounds like.
But what did Clay know? Mike certainly hadn't suggested that. But Clay began finding it harder to brush off what he was hearing from Mike. One day, Clay and Mike were driving back together from a business meeting, chatting about their work, making small talk, when Mike's tone changed.
And he said, I need to ask you something. I said, okay.
Mike told him it was about money and Denise.
He said, so I got the Visa card bill, and there was a $3,000 cash advance.
Not growing up with much, Mike was careful about money. He had an agreement with Denise that they would never spend more than $50 without checking with each other. And Denise had never told him about this.
$3,000 was $3,000. And I said, wow. I said, what was the deal? And he said, well, Denise tells me that she owed a drug debt.
This was the first Clay had ever heard about Denise and drugs.
And I said, what? And he said, yeah, she said, she owed a drug debt to Brian. Brian had been getting her some drugs.
Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend, Denise's best friend Kathy's husband. The guy Blythe Newsome had identified as the dominant figure in the foursome, maybe dominant to the point of being domineering. Mike's head had to be spinning at this point. What was Brian doing?
And I said, well, what kind of drugs? And he said, marijuana. So I say, Mike, how is she consuming the marijuana? He said, she's digesting it in brownies. And I said, Mike, Denise would be as big as I am if she was eating that $3,000 worth of marijuana-laced brownies. I said, that just don't make any sense to me. And he said, yeah, that's what it is.
Clay was skeptical. He was certain Denise hadn't spent $3,000 on pot brownies she'd bought from Brian or anyone else. What she had spent it on, he had no idea. But that wasn't the only worrying thing Mike had found out about Denise.
And he said, and I have found out that she and Brian's wife, Kathy, have been taking trips down to rave clubs in Orlando while I've been out of town on business. And I said, what? I said, man, this just doesn't sound right. And he said, I know.
Why hadn't Denise told Mike about any of this? Why was he finding out from a credit card statement what his wife and their closest couple friends had been doing when he was away? Why did it suddenly feel like Denise had so many secrets?
And so I said, well, I don't know, Mike. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He said, I'm concerned for my child more than anything in the world. And he said, I'm going to divorce her and I'm going to get custody of my child.
Clay pulled the car over to the side of the road.
And I said, whoa, buddy. I said, first off, let's just back up. I said, this is being all compressed into one weekend and a $3,000 charge card bill. I said, let's just take a giant deep breath before you haul off and do this. I would really think twice about it. Don't make any decisions today that we might regret tomorrow.
When he dropped Mike off, Clay struggled to process what he'd just heard.
My head's swirling. I'm going, why in the world did Mike Williams dump this on me? I don't know how to solve this. I mean, what kind of advice do I have for him?
All he could do was hope that Mike would find a way through.
I was like praying for this thing to blow over and for things to get better.
Mike took Clay's advice and didn't press things with Denise, but he was still miserable. He told friends he and Denise hadn't had sex in months. He also hadn't forgotten the strange cash advances from their credit card and the secret nights out with Brian and Kathy when he was away. Somewhere along the way, his marriage with his beloved high school sweetheart had gone awry. It was the fall of 2000 now. Ansley was 1 year old. Mike and Denise's 6th anniversary was coming up in mid-December, and Mike had planned a getaway to Apalachicola, a picturesque coastal town nearby. Maybe this could be an opportunity to patch things up, renew their connection, and move past this little hitch in their marriage. Just before the anniversary trip, Denise's friend Blythe was hurrying through a strip mall parking lot.
My husband and I had taken the kids kind of last-minute Christmas shopping.
The store was decorated for the holidays, seasonal music playing, harried parents rushing past a man collecting donations for charity. That's when Blythe realized, wait, I know that guy.
Mike was ringing the Salvation Army bell, the red bucket, and Denise and Ansley were there with him. It was a pleasant surprise. It was great to see them.
They stopped to catch up. Denise and Mike had big plans for the weekend.
Mike was always hunting. He worked hard during the week, but he loved to do his hunting.
So that was the first thing on the agenda, a Saturday hunt. Mike was going to wake up early and go do his thing. His plan, in fact, was to go with Brian. And then after Mike got back, he would have his trip with Denise.
They were going to go out of town the next day for their anniversary.
Blythe thought Mike and Denise seemed happy. In fact, just a couple days earlier, Mike and Denise had told Mike's mom, Cheryl, that they were going to start trying for a second baby. Maybe their relationship problems were a thing of the past. After chatting for a little longer, Blythe gathered her kids and said goodbye to Denise and Mike.
I hugged her, and then we went on our way. Just never imagining.
That would be the last time Blythe, or any of their friends, saw Denise and Mike together. Mike's boss, Clay Ketchum, was just getting out of bed that Sunday morning. His kids were in town, and he was thinking about what they were going to do that day when the phone rang. It was one of Denise's sisters.
She said, Clay, Denise wanted me to call you and tell you that Mike never returned from a hunting trip yesterday. And I said, what? Well, where did he go? She said, Lake Seminole. I didn't take a shower or anything. I just put on a pair of blue jeans and grabbed a jacket.
Clay's wife, Patty, was right behind him.
When we got in the car, we headed for Lake Seminole as fast as we could.
As the Ketchums drove west, the landscape outside their window changed from suburban housing developments into stands of pine trees. When they finally arrived at the lake, the scene was surreal.
There was an airplane landing in the road. I'll never forget that. Law enforcement people, helicopters, you've got airplanes, you've got people in boats, people parked all up and down the road. I mean, this was a huge, extensive manhunt, which made your heart stop, but you were so thankful people were there.
Everywhere they turned, they saw law enforcement methodically combing the area.
I got there probably at the break of day.
Alton Renew was a game warden for Florida's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
And by the time we got the boats in the water, it was daylight.
He knew both Mike and Brian. He'd often seen them hunting out there.
I checked them in the water in their blinds. A lot of times I'd be at the landing checking duck hunters as they came in, and those two were together most of the time.
But Alton had a much more urgent task right now, and the elements weren't cooperating. It had dropped to 21 degrees overnight, rare for North Florida, even in December.
I'm I guess you could say a redneck, so I put a garbage bag upside down over me to go over my underwear down my legs, and that would help break the wind, keep the wind from hitting my body. You see those old guys with ice on them beards and mustaches. That's the way we were. It was tough.
But if they were cold, what about Mike? It was likely he'd be wet and possibly injured. More volunteers kept showing up all the time.
There were so many people trying to search that we'd have to coordinate it where they wouldn't just run over each other.
Mike's friend, Scott Dungy, was one of those searchers. He'd been out there all day, and as the sun started to go down, he decided to stay and keep watch.
I was just hoping that he had hit his head and had been knocked out. He would just wake up in the middle of the night. I just wanted to be there when he came walking out.
He kept his gaze out on the dark water, waiting for something, some sliver of hope.
We did have a floodlight, and we did shine the light out.
But then, as he looked, he realized that he was being watched.
And there was a lot of eyes out on the lake.
Alligator eyes, glinting in the spotlight. Scott had already seen those big gators from the search helicopter earlier in the day. Now, he feared they might hold the answer to what had happened to his friend.
I just put it together in my head. He was going out this way to the bigger part of the lake. He hit this stump right here. It's 10, 12 foot deep in this area. So, he fell out of the boat. I'm sure he had his waders on because he always wore his waders. And they filled up, he drowned, and then a gator got him.
As Scott was beginning to fear the worst, Clay and Patty Ketchum decided they needed to check up on Denise. With Mike gone, they couldn't even imagine what she was feeling. They drove back from Lake Seminole through the swampy pine groves to Tallahassee and Denise and Mike's house. They pulled into the circular driveway outside the grand plantation-style home with white columns in the front.
Denise's mother met us at the door, and she said, "Oh, great, Denise will be wanting to see you." She said, "Come on in."
While she went to get Denise, Clay and Patty turned and looked into the living room. The scene seemed just as surreal as those airplanes landing near Lake Seminole.
The Christmas tree was lit. The presents were all under the tree, wrapped with bows. And there was a punch bowl. And I remember Patty and I looking in each other's eyes going, what the heck? Is some kind of Christmas party here or something?
Some of the guests came over to Patty and said hello.
The men wearing khaki pants and then, button-down shirts, and the women had on their Christmas sweaters. And Clay and I were sunburned and dirty and muddy and sad.
Had they dreamed up this whole thing about Mike disappearing? Had none of these people heard? What the hell was going on? As Clay and Patty stood there awkwardly in a state of disbelief, Denise came running downstairs.
And I just remember her kind of collapsing in my arms, and she was sobbing, and I was crying, and it was just it was a sad moment. And then she kind of pulled herself together, and she kind of pushed off and said, "But we're going to find him. They are going to find him, and that's why I'm here."
Denise explained that she hadn't gone out to Lake Seminole because she thought as soon as Mike was found, he'd be airlifted to a hospital. That's where she wanted to be. That's where she could help her husband.
So she said, "I don't know if they're going to take him to Dothan, or Panama City, or back to Tallahassee, and I want to be here so that I can be ready to go wherever they're going to take him to the hospital." So I totally understand. And she hugged Patty, and it was a short conversation, and she excused herself and went back upstairs.
Clay and Patty weren't sure what to think. It wasn't how they would react in a situation like this, but what Denise said made sense in the moment. So they went to check up on the other person who loved Mike the most, his mother, Cheryl.
So we drove on up through the driveway, and the house was just absolutely dark in the front. So we got around to the back, and there was a light on in the kitchen. And so we went up to the back porch, knocked on the door, and Miss Cheryl came to the door.
She was there with her other son, Mike's brother, Nick.
We all hugged each other, and we just sat around the kitchen table talking. And, the reality was settling in on the family.
They were trying to be hopeful, but it was difficult.
He had been missing now for over 24 hours, and it was freezing. The survivability in that kind of weather, with no provisions for it, it's just almost impossible.
The weather was concerning, but something else was on Cheryl's mind, something she suspected and wasn't yet ready to say out loud. But she gave a hint that night.
As we went to leave, Miss Cheryl said, "I just don't believe he's in the lake."
Clay and Patty didn't take much notice of Cheryl's comment as they drove away. But in retrospect, it was the beginning of a chain of events that they'd still be reeling from 2 decades later. All they knew then, though, was that Mike was missing, and his prospects looked grim. The next day ended with no Mike. The week ended with no Mike. Then 2 weeks. No Mike. After 44 days, law enforcement called off the search. Fish and Wildlife said they had found, quote, no definitive evidence of a boating accident or a fatality. Their only conclusion was the most obvious and least satisfying thing you could say. Mike was still missing. The bodies of those who have drowned almost always float to the surface within a week, but not Mike. Maybe Cheryl had been right. Maybe everyone was looking in the wrong place. Maybe everyone was making the wrong assumptions about what had happened and who was to blame. Coming up on this season of Over My Dead Body, Gone Hunting.
He looked straight up at me, and we just looked into each other's eyes like, that's unusual.
He said, this couple, there's no secrets that they have that I'm not aware of. Wonder if that's true.
Everybody thought she was crazy, and it was just a mother's love.
He was telling her that he was going to burn down my house if she didn't stop dating me.
And he pulled out a gun and he put it right here in my ribs.
Every time that anything comes up about Mike, that is a lie.
That was kind of shocking, that someone can be that cold and evil.
He's going to know that I told and he's going to come for me.
They made a deal with the devil.
It comes down to my life or his. And I'm asking you, please, choose life.
From Wondery, this is episode 1 of 6 of Over My Dead Body, Gone Hunting. A series about the extremes of love and betrayal. Over My Dead Body, Gone Hunting is hosted by me, Jennifer Portman. This series is written and reported by Eric Barton. Producer is Denise Chan. Senior producer is Russell Finch. Story editor is Eric Benson. Consulting producer is me, Jennifer Portman. Production assistance by Evangeline Barras. Sound design and mixing by Michelle Macklem. Music supervisor is Scott Velasquez for Frizon Sync. Fact-checking by Annika Robbins. Senior managing producer is Lata Pandya. Managing producer is Olivia Weber. And coordinating producer is Heather Beloga. Executive producers are George Lavender, Marshall Louie, and Jen Sargent for Wondery.